Hello everybody, and welcome to this review/discussion video about The Witness. I just finished recording a Let's Play of this game, and I wanted to do a separate video to detail my thoughts/feelings about this game because there are quite a few things I want to talk about. If you're here just for the review and you have played through The Witness, welcome! I highly recommend checking out the Let's Play though, because I had a lot of fun recording it, and I hope you enjoy watching it as well. If you have just watched the Let's Play and you just got to this video, I will be talking about the ending that we just watched, the second ending, as some people like to call it. But first, I wanted to give my overall thoughts about the game, as well as some of my responses to criticisms of the game. And then we're going to go into some of the actual gameplay elements and what I thought of them, and then we're going to wrap things up with some final thoughts. First of all, I'm going to just go ahead and get this out of the way right now. I really enjoyed this game a lot. But I want to put a caveat on that and kind of address one of the criticisms that's been often lobbed at this game. And I think it is a valid criticism from a certain point of view, and that is that if you enjoy solving puzzles for puzzles' sake, then you will like this game a lot. I do think that this viewpoint holds some validity. Personally, I do enjoy solving puzzles for puzzles' sake, which is one reason why I enjoyed playing this game. I think part of the reason why some people haven't really quite latched onto this game as much as they might have thought themselves is because it kind of feels like a bait and switch in some respects. And I can understand this viewpoint. Partially, this is because of the way the game was positioned during its development cycle. When this game was being developed, Jonathan Blow wrote blog posts about everything that was happening and the different areas of the island that were being constructed and some of the inspirations for them. And one of the biggest inspirations that this game had behind it was, as you might guess, Myst. Much like Myst, The Witness plops you onto an island. It's a first-person adventure in which you have no clue what you're doing there, and you have to solve puzzles in order to progress through the game. However, unlike Myst, The Witness doesn't exactly have that much of a deep story for you to get invested in. In Myst, you are placed into a family drama that you can affect for better or worse. You get onto the island, and you have no clue what your role in the story is, but as time goes on, you learn bits and pieces of the story. You get to understand the characters, their motivations, what you're doing there, and ultimately what kind of impact you can make by the time the end game comes into play. In The Witness, you don't exactly have that level of story. You basically have an environment that you can explore and solve puzzles in, and for some people, this is not sufficient for a game. And I can definitely respect this. I personally think this game has more to offer than just puzzles, though, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I can understand that for some adventure gamers who value story above a lot of other elements in a video game, this can definitely feel a little bit disappointing, and the lack of a satisfying ending, particularly if you get to the cage at the bottom of the mountain, can feel like a cop-out. And in fact, I was kind of feeling this way when I first played through the game myself. I went through the whole game, learned all the different elements, got to the mountain, went down to the bottom, got into the cage, and started flying around the island, only to see all the panels shut off. My first thought was actually panic. I wasn't really sure what was going on and how this would impact the game going forward. Would I have to start over? Could I restore a save file? I had hope that I could restore a save file, and sure enough, I was able to, so my concerns were at least a little bit allayed. And then after the game was over, I went back up and discovered the environmental puzzles, or at the very least I discovered that there were much more of them than I initially thought, because I had discovered a couple up to that point. But I could definitely appreciate why someone who had spent all this effort going through all the puzzles and going into the mountain and doing all those things could feel cheated. So that's one of the criticisms of the game that I could definitely see being valid from a certain point of view. The next one comes from the premise of the game. And this is where I'm going to talk about the endings for the game and what story the game does contain. The game definitely presents itself as basically a series of puzzles. In fact, I entitled the first video Puzzle Paradise in this Let's Play because that's basically what the game presents itself as at first. You get onto the island, you see a panel, you start playing around with it, and you little by little learn the different rules that govern the puzzles around the island. And at first, this seems to be something that basically dictates whether you're going to like the game or not. Because for a long time, this seems to be the only thing that the game provides you. Sorry about that, I had to move my mouse to prevent my screensaver from being activated there. For a long time, this seems to be the only thing that the game gives you. You have puzzles, and you have some audio logs around the island that you may or may not find that ruminate about life and God and science and religion and materialism and mysticism and Buddhism and Zen philosophy and all kinds of stuff. And you wonder how in the world this all relates to each other and itself, essentially. But there doesn't seem to be any story in the game. But if you were able to discover that hidden cavern in the mountain, then things take a little bit of a turn. And this is where the game got a little bit more interesting for me, because I finally saw that little piece of story and I wondered, wait a second, what's really going on here? Especially when the voice actors began having more normal conversations rather than just quoting the scholars and thinkers that we hear in the audio logs. We start hearing about doubts about whether or not the experiment that's being put together is actually going to be successful or not. We start hearing some second thoughts about whether some of the thinkers and the philosophers that have the quotes are going to be actually beneficial to the program that's being built. And in doing so, we discover that the whole island is essentially a simulation. A simulation that some company has apparently built in order for people to escape and find enlightenment or think about life, etc. And I thought this was interesting, at the very least until I got to the second ending, and I discovered that the simulation seemed to be a failure. After all, when you get to the second ending and you discover that the guy that you seem to be playing as wakes up from the simulation, his muscles start malfunctioning, or at the very least they've atrophied during the time he's been inside the program, and everything he sees around life is a circle. In fact, he's become so obsessed with circles that he can't really see anything else. It's kind of reminiscent of the sort of madness that Brian Moriarty discusses in the Secret of Psalm 46 video when he talks about how people see patterns and become obsessed with finding them. In fact, there is apparently, according to Jonathan Blow, one more Easter egg in this game that no one has apparently discovered yet. And some people, much like Brian Moriarty's Masquerade story, have been going crazy on the internet trying to find this, to be the one to actually discover it. And I think this second ending kind of speaks to this a little bit, because if you become too engrossed in something, you too can miss out on the things that are right in front of you. And I think this sort of conflicting set of viewpoints is what makes The Witness a little bit of a tough cookie to swallow for some people. Because it presents you with a lot of different pieces of philosophy and different viewpoints to chew on scattered around the island, but doesn't give you any concrete answers about them. In fact, both of the endings in their own way are unsatisfactory. I've actually heard some people on the internet compare the game's puzzles to various approaches for life, with some people claiming that the panel puzzles are meant to represent science with its very observable, quantifiable rule sets, and the environmental puzzles as being more transcendent, being more religious. And I can definitely see why the people would be making these comparisons, because the island itself seems to be making the distinction throughout its sets of recordings. Even the films in theater seem to be making the distinction. The ones on the left, if you watched all of them, the ones on the left that are presented by James Burke and Richard Feynman are very scientific. Whereas the ones on the right are definitely a lot more on the spiritual side. You could argue that the ones in the middle are kind of a combination of the two. The third one, the one that features the ending of the Andrei Tarkovsky film Nostalgia, features a man who is singularly devoted to carrying that candle across the dried mineral pool, and it's a single shot that lasts for about 10 minutes or so. And you could basically make the argument that this is a dogged pursuit, like some people might claim religion to be, of something that's very material. Whereas The Secret of Psalm 46 explores concepts in the material world that some people also have a dogged determination to find, like Easter eggs. And some people, in doing so, are able to walk away with a sense of awe, a feeling that a lot of people might describe as religious. So I could definitely see why the third and the fourth videos could be considered a marriage of those two viewpoints. Whereas the fifth and sixth videos are pretty exclusively spiritual, and the first and second videos are pretty exclusively scientific. But because the game presents all these viewpoints, it doesn't really seem to be making any point. And I think this is what frustrates some people, is that it gives you a lot to chew on, but at the same time it gives you almost nothing to chew on. And it's this that I think a lot of people get frustrated with, is that it's a game that claims to have a lot to say, or at the very least it has more to say than other video games, but at the same time, it doesn't really give you something to walk away with. It just gives you something to think about. Personally, I'm not quite as bothered by this. I think games, or at least some forms of art, don't necessarily have to give you answers. I think they can give you a lot to think about. But I think the format in which this game gives you all that stuff is in and of itself divisive. Because the game, much like it was presenting itself as a sort of spiritual successor to Myst during its development cycle, was also presenting itself as something a little bit more highbrow than the typical gaming fare during its development cycle. It was something that was more of a thinker's game. It wasn't just a mindless shooter or something that involved using quick reflexes. And to this extent, I do agree that it does give you something to think about, but it still exists in a context that involves game mechanics. You go through the island, you solve the panel puzzles, you learn the mechanics. All these things are pasted onto an environment that is a game world. It is still a video game that involves learning about things, and for that, it doesn't exactly feel that different in that regard. And I think some people, again, feel a little bit of a bait and switch when they enter this game world and feel like everything is still a video game. In fact, the island kind of has a certain sort of sheen to it that makes it look sort of fake. It kind of looks plastic in a sense. And I think if the whole purpose was to be a virtual reality simulation, then it kind of is left lacking in that regard. But the thing about this is that in some ways this could be intentional. In some ways this may not necessarily be by accident. And I don't think there's any escaping that this game's creation across 7 years is ultimately going to be a reflection of its creator. In fact, I don't think any video game created across that period of time, and particularly by one person driving the whole creative force behind it, is ever going to escape that reality. And this is a struggle that I've been seeing in the video game world, a sort of tension that's certainly escalated in recent years, and that is the plight of the singular artist producing a work. And I want to be very careful with how I phrase this, because I may sound very negative about this, but really, much like a lot of things in life, this is kind of something that comes with its own mixed bag of good and bad. Kickstarter in recent years has served as a crowdfunding platform for auteurs who actually have something to say, who have something to share with the world but can't get publishers to get behind it. And as someone who has funded a lot of Kickstarter projects, including board games and video games, this is actually something that I appreciate a lot. However, one of the things that I think has been detrimental to this has been putting the artist, the lone artist, up on a pedestal. And I think games like this, in some ways, kind of do that. They present a game world that's pretty much the brainchild of its creator. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just say this right now, I do like what I'm seeing here. I'm not trying to criticize this game, but I do want to criticize what this game might accomplish. And essentially that is putting the artist on a pedestal to the point where any sort of feedback given to the artist is pretty much dismissed. And this is something that is kind of a bit of a paradox in our world today, is that we like seeing artists getting the platform and the place that they can actually express themselves, but at the same time, we want to actually speak into their product. And this is something that I struggle a lot with, because I myself enjoy creative endeavors on my own, but I also want other people to be able to give me feedback on those creative endeavors. But where does that line get drawn when creative endeavors start getting affected too much by the feedback? When does that product stop being your own and it starts being the audience's? And I think in today's world, sometimes we can veer off one end of the spectrum too far. Either way, it doesn't really matter. I think both ends of the spectrum, both extremes, can get represented pretty easily in our world now. Either we glorify the artist to the point where no feedback is the ideal, and basically we get a product that is very single-minded in its goal, and I'd argue that this game is one of those. Or we go the exact opposite direction, and we want to speak into the artist's work to the point where it's no longer his work. It's basically a death of the author kind of situation. And I think this game is a very Jonathan Blow game. I think I'm not an expert on Jonathan Blow, but I do know enough about him to know that he is very opinionated about the things he's passionate about, and to know that a lot of people agree and disagree with him on a great many points. But one of the things that seems to have attracted some criticism, at least in the case of this game, is that the game comes from a place of comfort. It's a game about a virtual reality simulation that allows people to escape from the real world and come into a world where they can just contemplate and think. And to be honest, I'm not really sure I would have done this much differently, so I can't really criticize this too heavily, but I do want to at least mention this, that it definitely seems to come from that place where it comes from an artist that's very successful, because Jonathan Blow made Braid a few years before this, so it definitely comes from that place where, you know, some success precedes it, and it's not really necessarily feeling like it has anything to say. I don't think video games necessarily have to say anything about this, but this game almost seemed to go out of its way to make sure that it was kind of inoffensive. In fact, there was even an audio log late in the game that we encountered that mentioned that the game was not supposed to actually invoke human drama in this world. And I think in some respects this is both good and bad. On one hand, this game world can exist on its own independent of society as it stands right now. But with that comes the very real reality that we're not actually speaking into the world as it exists right now. We're trying to escape from the world. And this definitely seems to be a very intentional design choice by Jonathan Blow. I don't really have any preference in this regard. I personally was not bothered by this that much, but I can certainly understand why some people left this game feeling very empty. It's a game that seems to have something to say, but then it ultimately doesn't really have much to say at all. It leaves you in the place where you can draw your own conclusions. For some people, particularly people who want there to be an end destination, an end goal, a single message that a game sets out to have, this can be rather frustrating. Again, I wasn't bothered by it, but it is something to think about. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I do believe that this game is a game about meditation. I think it's a game about contemplation. You'll notice throughout the game that there are various talks about Zen Buddhism, and in fact, the speech at the very end of the first ending, where you go into the cage, comes from the 9th century document known as the Diamond Sutra, which is about letting go and basically rejecting this material world and whatnot. I don't really know all the details, but a lot of the principles that the game refers to when discussing Zen Buddhism are reflected in that document. And I think a lot of what this game is espousing is that it's not necessarily about the destination, it's about the journey. And that's kind of the feeling I was left with after I went to the cage originally. In fact, it was actually the feeling I was left with also when I encountered this ending over here, with the hidden hotel and all the stuff that revealed the company that built the whole island and ultimately allowed me to go back to the real world. I don't know what exactly the game was trying to prove by saying that I had to solve the environmental puzzles in order to wake up, but I do think that the environmental puzzles are a very interesting way of proving the game's point that enlightenment is actually right in front of you. It's not necessarily something that you achieve by getting to the top of the mountain. In fact, the top of the mountain seems to be a very bleak place in this game. It's a place where everyone has kind of reached the apex of their art and kind of gives up and can't really go any further. In fact, the only way to go is down into madness. You go into the mountain and everything kind of becomes progressively more difficult to look at. The puzzles in which there are flashing lights and their colors going crazy immediately come to mind here. But at the very bottom, you're left, when you go into the cage, with a feeling that everything that you encountered along the way, that's being undone before your very eyes, is ultimately the point. And to some people, I can see why that would feel a little bit like a bait and switch. But when you find the environmental puzzles, I feel like that's yet another example of something that is right in front of you that you can look at and enjoy. And I think on that level, I really enjoy the game a lot. As I mentioned earlier in the Let's Play, the environmental puzzles really reminded me a lot of the wooden eye challenges from Riven. For those of you who haven't played Riven, there's a sequence of puzzles on one of the islands where you have to match animal shapes or silhouettes to various locations, and the locations are marked by a wooden eye that appears in the exact place that an eye would appear in the animal that's being drawn there. The thing about these puzzles is that you have to look at them from a certain perspective. You can't see them if you're just going throughout the world looking at all the tiny little details. You have to step back and look at the world from a different point of view. And I really enjoy the fact that this game was built with that kind of perspective shift in mind. That it's not necessarily about getting from point A to point B to point C to point D to point E and so on. It's about looking at what's in front of you and appreciating it. In fact, a lot of the machinery around the island seems to be intentionally slow in order to force you to slow down, ranging from the lasers to the elevators. Just about everything around the island is intentionally measured in order to get you to be measured in the way you approach everything. Which brings me to the gameplay, because I'm sure that's what some people originally wanted to hear more about instead of all the philosophical stuff. Let me talk a little bit about the gameplay of this game, because it's something that a lot of people have been discussing, and that is what I thought about the way the concepts were taught, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to be wondering about what I thought of the challenge as well. First of all, the concepts. I really enjoyed the way the game starts. I really enjoy how this first section over here with the garden here inside these castle walls gives you an idea of how to interact with the panels before introducing you to the language of symbologies that you'll have to encounter out here that inform how you're supposed to actually use the panels. I do appreciate that once you do get out here, the path that you follow is pretty simple, and it actually leads you to the black and white square area first. And from there, you can actually go to the orchard where you discover the apples. This section of the game actually confused me at first, because I thought, wait a minute, this doesn't actually lead to anything. It just leads to a little garden with a bunch of drawings. There's not even any environmental puzzles there, nor are there recordings. There is, however, an apple that got cut up and partially eaten by somebody. In fact, I wonder if that's the apple from the tree that didn't have one in that sequence of puzzles. But the point is that the game is gradually beginning to introduce to you the idea of finding things in the environment that you may not have seen from a certain point of view. And this gets compounded when you then go out into the Symmetry Island area and you see the different shapes that the rocks make. And in fact, we didn't look at it in the Let's Play, but if you use the boat, that long string of red stuff around the rocks forms a strand of hair that's attached to what appears to be the shape of a woman that the rocks create when you view them from that point of view. It's little details like that, the fact that these little rocks can exist without getting in each other's way, that I found really fascinating. And then came, potentially, one of my least favorite parts of the game when I first played through it, which was the Light Temple. Personally, I was not a big fan of this area. I think it did pretty well forcing you to actually stop and look around and see how to use your surroundings. But as a puzzle, it progressively got worse, particularly in the area inside the water cavern where you had to actually drain and raise the water over and over again. That was pretty obnoxious. Thankfully, the game got back on track for me after that. But I think a lot of the other areas of the game can be rather frustrating if you approach them in a certain order. For example, and I'll just go ahead and reference this, there seems to be 4 different concepts in the game that are taught that are ultimately built upon. The 4 concepts are the black and white squares, the dots that you have to hit along your route, the Tetris blocks, as I'm going to call them, and then the sunbursts that you encounter in the Ewok village area. All 4 of these concepts are basically building blocks that the other concepts in the game build upon. For example, the Light Temple builds upon just the very act of going through a maze by pointing out the path of the maze. The Symmetry Island adds a little bit of a wrinkle by introducing a second path. The quarry area is probably the biggest set of wrinkles because it combines the Tetris blocks and the sunbursts in a way that adds another element, in this case eliminating one of the rules that the game gives you. Even the sunburst area uses the Tetris blocks in some of the optional puzzles there. But ultimately, all the stuff that you learn is culminating at the town, and then is ultimately used in some different respects in the mountain. And I like the way this built up, I really did. But I can see that if you went to the quarry first, for example, this could be really, really alienating to a first-time player, not knowing what any of the symbols mean and feeling like the game expects you to know them. Personally, I like the fact that the game doesn't hold your hand. In fact, the only bit of intrusion, if you want to call it that the game gives you where it tells you what to do is at the very beginning when it tells you how to use your mouse to open up the panels in that pipe that you see there. That's pretty much it. The rest you have to figure out on your own, and I like the fact that the game doesn't hold your hand. But if you visit the areas of the island in the wrong order, for example, if you go to the town first and see all that stuff there and have no clue what to do with it, it can be a very daunting experience. And I kind of wish that the game held your hand a little bit more as far as what areas you went to and what order you went to them. But I can appreciate why Jonathan Blow decided to make this non-linear. I do appreciate the freedom and the amount of choice there, and the fact that you could walk away from a puzzle. So, once again, this is one of those examples of the game happening to align with my tastes, and it perhaps not aligning with everyone else's. Now, let me talk about the challenge a little bit. Actually, before I talk about that, let me talk about the mountain. The mountain was an interesting experience the first time around. It actually took me a while to get down through it. It's a little bit longer than the Let's Play time, but not by much. I think the time I spent down in the floor puzzle in the bottom was offset by some of the time I spent earlier in the color puzzles especially. And especially that set of that purple path that we had to draw on the top floor. I spent a lot longer on those things when I originally played the game versus when I did them in the Let's Play. But I appreciated how the mountain took the concepts you learned and presented them in completely new ways that actually forced you to solve the puzzles in ways that actually encourage you to basically use the concepts that you've learned in ways that you actually have been building but not necessarily know you've built. Now, some people have thought of the challenge as a very jarring departure from the rest of the game simply because it imposes a time limit on you. But actually, I don't view it as a jarring departure at all. I think it's actually a natural extension of the rest of the game, and unlike a lot of other endgame content in some video games, it is optional. You don't actually have to beat the challenge in order to access the cavern behind it, which is something I didn't know until I did this Let's Play. Additionally, I have watched one video. It is the video titled The Unbearable Now, and if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend watching it alongside this analysis, because I have drawn some of my points from it. There is a segment of that video that actually talks about the challenge and compares it to that scene in The Karate Kid in which Daniel-san finds out the reason for the menial chores he's been given by Mr. Miyagi. It turns out that all those chores really were preparation for learning karate moves and being able to defend himself. And in a similar vein, I think the challenge actually accomplishes this. I do believe that the change to doing something on a timed level is jarring. On that, I do agree. I heard it was a lot harder initially, and that they made it easier, but I am glad that it does exist, because it actually does force you to take the concepts that you've learned throughout the game and realize, hey, I actually do understand how to interact with these various symbols and mechanics, and it forces you to do so in a way that gets your brain going, and actually makes you realize, hey, I actually do know how to use this much more than I think I know how to use this. And it's very empowering once you actually do solve it. I will say that during the 5-hour period I spent solving it the first time around, when I wasn't doing a Let's Play and when I was going through the game for the first time, by the time I got done, not only was I ready to eat something, I felt like I had just conquered a whole mountain. It was that kind of satisfaction. And I really enjoyed that a lot. I don't think that the challenge is necessarily a mark off for this game. I do believe that because it's optional, maybe not for 100% completion, but certainly for completion, because it's optional, the purpose it serves pretty well. And I do appreciate that it's there. Overall, my thoughts on The Witness are as follows. I enjoyed the game. I think it's not for everybody. And I think it's for that reason that I enjoyed doing the Let's Play. And I recognize that in some ways I'm kind of defeating the point of the game by doing the Let's Play, but I'm okay with that. The game is meant to be a solitary experience that gives you an escape from the real world and allows you to form your own journey, basically, by going through this set of puzzles. But much like the game kind of contradicts itself with the various philosophies it espouses throughout the island, it also contradicts itself in that purpose too, because by the time you're done, you've basically learned the exact same things as everyone else who's played the game. You've been through the exact same puzzles, maybe in a different order. But it's because of that I wanted to actually give you guys the opportunity to watch this game in a Let's Play format. I personally like this game a lot. I understand it's not for everyone, and maybe some people prefer to watch a Let's Play of it and not play the game themselves, and that's totally fine. So I figured I will allow you guys to enjoy my experience and just leave it at that and just have a good time with it. So with that being said, this video is a wrap. I'm going to go ahead and end the Let's Play here, end the discussion here. If you guys have any thoughts about the game you'd like to share, feel free to do so in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this Let's Play a lot. I think it's been a fun experience for sure. And either way, I will catch you on the flip side. So take care, and I will catch you then.